The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. When Jesus saw the vast crowd, his heart was moved with pity for them, for they were like sheep without a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things. By now it was already late, and his disciples approached him and said, "This is a deserted place, and it's already very late. Dismiss them so they can go to the surrounding farms and villages and buy themselves something to eat." Jesus said to them in reply, "Give them some food yourselves." But they said to him, "Are we to buy 200 days' wages worth of food and give it to them to eat?" He asked them, "How many loaves do you have? Go and see." And when they had found out, they said, 5 loaves and 2 fish. So he gave orders to have them sit down in groups on the green grass. The people took their places in rows by hundreds and by 50s. Then, taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he said the blessing, broke the loaves, and gave them to his disciples to set before the people. He also divided the 2 fish among them all. They all ate and were satisfied. And they picked up 12 wicker baskets full of fragments of what was left of the fish, and what was left of the fish. Those who ate of the loaves were 5,000 men. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
I just couldn't help but wonder when it says 5,000 men. There were probably men because their wives were back home preparing the dinner for them and wondering why they were so late. That sort of thing does happen, doesn't it? This event of Jesus feeding a multitude with a small amount of loaves and fishes is the most often repeated event in the Scriptures. In the 4 Gospels, this event is told 6 times. That means very likely Jesus actually did this twice under 2 different circumstances, and we're not going to go into that today. But 6 times in the Gospel, Jesus is recorded as multiplying the loaves, feeding a large number of people with a very small amount of food. And it's significant to look, as I always like to do, to look behind the event, to discover where Jesus and the disciples and the crowds are coming from to enable this to happen. First of all, Jesus sees a vast crowd, and it says he had pity on them. He had compassion on them. And he nourished them. But not with the bread, but with his word. In other words, he taught them. He taught them the truth of the kingdom of God. That God's reign is now actually among them. And what does this call forth from you? That's what he was teaching them. How they should be able to be citizens of the kingdom of God. What does it mean to live with God as your king? Okay, that's the substance really of the Gospels. That's what he taught them, because he had pity on them. And then, having been nourished in spirit, he embodied the kingdom of God among them. He showed them in a very definite way that this is real by paying attention to the whole person. The earthly hungers as well. And to do this, he turns to the disciples and says to them, give them something to eat yourself. He doesn't say, and I think this is important for our understanding of the kingdom, he doesn't say, oh, don't worry, I'll take care of it. Poof, here's a whole bunch of loaves, go and feed them. No, he doesn't do that. And this is what's important for us to see. He asks an act of obedience from the disciples. He says, feed them yourselves. Obey me. Feed them yourselves. But we don't have anything. 5 loaves and a couple of fishes. And then he says, give them to me. He blesses them and breaks them. But there's still now 5 broken loaves and a whole bunch of pieces of fish from those 2 fishes. That's all that there is there. And then he says, go and give them to the people. The miracle happened, and it was God who did the miracle. You know, it wasn't that people were just pulling their own hidden treasures out and sharing it with one another. It was that God was doing a miracle, but the miracle happened because of the obedience of the disciples. They still just had these 5 loaves. And he says, go now and distribute them. And it's in that act of obedience, it's in that act of distributing that the miracle happened. In other words, they gave up. They were willing to give up what little they had. And what little they had became, in God's power, more and more and more. But that wouldn't have happened if they had not been obedient and done something that kind of went against all reason. They started passing it out, and it didn't stop. It didn't stop. It didn't stop. And then to show that this was truly the work of God, to show that this was truly the work of God, he ordered them to collect the fragments, and it filled 12 baskets. So the leftovers were far more than what the original was. That shows God's abundance. It also shows that insofar as we have experienced God's abundance, we need to listen to him, because we can't hoard his abundance. We have to share. Whatever we experience of God's abundance, we must share. And it's in that act of obedient sharing, in that act of giving up what might not even seem to be enough for ourselves, that God works. Can we trust that? That's the question that's given to us today.